How big is the federal debt?
I don't know.
I'm guessing quite a bit.
I know it's a heck of a lot more than it was probably 10 years ago.
Well, take a stab at it.
69 billion.
It's probably huge.
What if I told you it was $8.7 trillion?
That's pretty crazy. Shouldn't be that way.
$8.7 trillion. Just how much money is that? With a number this large, it helps to compare it to the overall size of America's economy, what economists call the gross domestic product, or GDP. In February 2007, when our federal debt was $8.7 trillion, our GDP was around $13.5 trillion. That meant that our federal debt was about 64% of our GDP. This level of debt to GDP is not the real problem. It's where we're headed that matters. If you were to add up all of the federal government's unfunded promises for Medicare and Social Security, you would see that as of September 30, 2007, America had dug itself into a $53 trillion hole, and it's getting deeper by at least $2 to $3 trillion every year by doing nothing. Unfortunately, with increasing budget deficits and recent government bailouts, we're now digging even faster. America faces 4 serious deficits today. The first is a budget deficit. The second is a savings deficit. The third is a balance of payments deficit, of which the trade deficit is a subset. And the fourth and most serious of all is a leadership deficit.
How can this be happening to the richest country in the world?
Well, we've lost our way, quite frankly. Let me tell you how we got to where we are. Today's federal debt is the sum of all of our annual budget deficits and surpluses going back to the beginning of our federal government. Our war for independence created much of our early debt, and by March 4th, 1789, the first day of our federal government, our national debt was $75 million, which was about 40% of our economy. This terrified our founding fathers, and they acted quickly to pay it down. We didn't stay there for long. The Civil War not only had a huge human cost, it brought the United States to the brink of bankruptcy. However, like before, we paid our debt down quickly. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created to help manage the nation's money supply and to oversee national banks. That year was also the birth of the modern income tax. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Several years later, the Great Depression brought with it extreme economic hardship for millions of Americans.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens.
It is insurance that you and your employer have bought and paid for.
World War II was a time of sacrifice, and while the government took on unprecedented levels of debt, Americans bought savings bonds to finance our winning the war.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Humphrey Bogart.
Our fighting men have just won history's greatest victory for freedom. Buy bonds for their future and for your own future.
We've got another bond to buy.
It's official. It's all over. It's total victory.
The large military and social spending practices of the 1960s and 70s were 2 key factors that led to a major economic downturn by the end of the 1970s. The 1980s saw the rise of supply-side economics.
It's morning again in America.
Reaganomics.
You're the trickle-down theory guy.
I'm betting my reputation on it.
The controversial Laffer curve proposed that lower marginal tax rates would eventually generate higher tax revenues. The theory did have its critics.
Let me just give you a difference that I have with Governor Reagan on taxes. It is what I call a voodoo economic policy.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present.
Read my lips.
The debate over supply-side economics continues to this day. But what is not debatable is that the federal debt exploded in the 1980s. A fundamental shift had occurred. America was becoming addicted to debt. Never before in our history had so much debt been created during an era of relative peace and prosperity. Yes, the Cold War ended, but it came at an extremely high price, and people from across the political spectrum were becoming very alarmed.
We come here today, Democrats and Republicans, to celebrate a true milestone for our nation. In a few moments, I will sign into law the first balanced budget in a generation.
The politics of sound fiscal policy are very difficult because the natural inertia in the political system, if you will, is toward federal programs, most of which are very useful. And therefore the inertia is towards spending on the one hand and tax cuts on the other hand. But if you're going to have sound fiscal conditions, you have got to both constrain your spending and you also have to provide for adequate revenues. And what ultimately is involved are very difficult trade-off decisions involving federal programs and what the American people want their government to do, and then providing the means to pay for it.
In the last 40 years, we've had 35 budget deficits and only 5 budget surpluses. But remember, we've been running large annual surpluses in our Social Security program for years. These surpluses are spent every year to help pay other bills in the federal government. Without the Social Security surpluses, our real track record on deficits looks a whole lot worse.
This is something that's utterly unsustainable, and remember, all of that has happened before the baby boomers retire. And the baby boomers are not a projection. They're born, they're out there, they're going to be eligible for Social Security and Medicare, and yet we can't pay our bills now.
In less than 10 years, Social Security will be paying out more than it takes in, and will only get worse as baby boomers retire in larger and larger numbers. By 2017, Social Security will not be helping to reduce our overall deficit, it will be adding to it. Our enormous Medicare deficits and other federal spending that also lie ahead will only make this situation worse.
The only issue that's more severe than this would be the idea that an Islamic fundamentalist would get his hands on or her hands on a nuclear weapon and use it against us. Beyond that, there's nothing that's more severe than this. This issue represents the potential fiscal meltdown of this nation, and it absolutely guarantees, if it's not addressed, that our children will have less of a quality of life than we've had, that they will have a government they can't afford, and that we will be demanding so much of them in the area of taxes that they will not have the money to send their kids to college or buy that home or just live a good quality of life.